Video number 7 in the Artificial Intelligence course, and I'm going to talk a bit about games or adversarial search, because really the kinds of games that we're going to talk about here are search problems. Now, games have a fairly special part to play in the history of AI research. AI has been interested in them right from the outset, and if you look into the history of the field, you'll find a program for playing checkers that was developed very early on using ideas that have a lot in common with what's now called reinforcement learning. And moving on from then, people have always really been interested in looking at AI for playing games. Now, the reasons for that are fairly straightforward to uncover. Games have historically been regarded as areas of human endeavour that require some level of human-like intelligence in order to play. And that's particularly the case for the more subtle and challenging games like chess and Go. Well, you can insert your own favourite there. Games also have the advantage that they tend to be quite well defined in terms of having a relatively simple rule set, but also to allow an awful lot of complexity to develop within that rule set. So in something like chess, the way in which the pieces can move is fairly straightforward, and one can teach even a child to play chess in the space of an afternoon. But once the gameplay and the rules are understood, there's a lifetime of exploration to be enjoyed if you like playing these kinds of games. Taken together, that means that firstly, they're a good target for actually writing programs because the rules are so nice and well defined. And secondly, they're interesting to researchers because they're sufficiently complex to make it a challenge to write a good AI agent to play a lot of these games. The level of complexity involved has traditionally been a little bit of a problem for philosophers, because there are plenty of examples on record of people saying that you could, for example, never come up with an AI agent that can beat the human chess champion. Well, here is a lesson on why you should be very careful claiming that something's not going to be possible. Now, games of the kinds that we're going to look at are interesting also because they take the idea of search a little bit beyond the basic intelligent search algorithms that we've already seen. What we're trying to do here is make an agent that can work out how to act when the outcomes of its actions are not known. So I mentioned in the earlier lectures the fact that clearly in real environments you have some element of non-determinism, in the sense that you can't necessarily be sure about what the outcomes of your actions will be. Games like chess and Go and so on are a particularly extreme example, because the non-determinism comes from the fact that you have an opponent who's actively trying to hinder you. You are trying to win the game, your opponent is trying to make you lose it. And that's a particularly extreme form of non-determinism. But it's a form of non-determinism nonetheless. Now, one can obviously make game-playing AIs that deal with a more benign form of non-determinism. So, for example, in about 1992, Gerald Tozaro came up with the TD Gammon player, which was for playing backgammon. And backgammon is a game where dice throws are involved, and there's an element of non-determinism introduced because of the randomness of the outcome of the dice throw. So that's an example of a game where the non-determinism is arguably more attuned to the sort of thing that we might want to design more general AI agents to deal with. And more recently, historically speaking, clearly there's been a lot of further interest in using games as a testbed for making AIs. There's been a lot of publicity about the application of methods that essentially come down to being deep reinforcement learning, initially for playing Atari games, and there you have an architecture that's got an awful lot in common with TD Gammon, but it's being used on a much bigger scale. Then we have the use of a whole bunch of techniques, including reinforcement learning, to play Go, but the initial success there also involved something called Monte Carlo tree search. So even with that kind of recent development, the idea of intelligent search is still something that might be useful to us. I'm not going to talk about anything in this course beyond the classical approach to playing two-person games in AI. And this involves modeling game playing essentially as a search problem. And the classical algorithm that one can devise for playing games here is called the minimax algorithm. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and about some of the problems that are inherent in its use. And then I'm going to finish up by talking about alpha-beta pruning, which is a way in which we can try again and address the fact that game playing of this kind, when modeled as a search problem, has very high computational complexity. Alpha-beta pruning allows us to prune the search tree that's involved. And by prune here, I mean just avoid searching certain parts of it. But alpha-beta pruning allows us to do this in a way that allows us to guarantee that we don't miss any possibilities. Now, while I'm not going to talk about the more recent methods here, it's still important to understand minimax with alpha-beta pruning and the place that it has historically in AI research, because it is essentially what was used in the first system that was able to beat the world chess champion. The system produced by IBM that beat Garry Kasparov is essentially using minimax with alpha-beta pruning for a large part of what it does. There are various other things that are included in that system, but the real core of it is the algorithm that I'm about to talk about. So we're interested in a particular kind of game, and one which, as I've suggested, is useful because although it's a highly idealized kind of environment for an AI agent to be operating in, it still provides a really nice source of hard problems. And these problems are computationally difficult. In chess, now, you don't really have to be a chess player to follow what I'm about to say. All you really need to know is that the games we're talking about here have two players. They take it in turns to make a move within the game. There is a well-defined bunch of rules about how you can move. There is a well-defined bunch of rules about when there is a win or a loss or a draw. And the game is balanced in the sense that an advantage for one player tends to be a disadvantage for the other. Now, looked at as a search problem, and that's something that we're going to do in a moment, for chess the average branching factor is about 35. Now, if you think of a tree with a branching factor of 35, and in particular, if you've done the problem sheet and thought a little bit about how these trees grow, it should be clear that this is potentially an extremely difficult search problem. The games can reach 50 moves per player, so that implies a really big search tree, possibly 35 to the power of 100 nodes. And in fact, even if you only consider the legal positions, you're talking about 10 to the 40 as the size of the search space. In addition to that, you've got uncertainty due to the fact that the opponent is trying to thwart you at every possible part of the game. So search is already looking quite hard here, and in fact it did take a very long time to come up with a system that could play chess to a world-class human standard. Now, Go is much, much harder than chess. There, you don't have an 8 by 8 board that's governing the average branching factor. You have a 19 by 19 board. So the branching factor is much, much higher. And that has always made it unlikely that the methods that I'm about to talk about would be used to conquer Go. And in fact, the methods that were used to conquer Go were very different, fundamentally different, to the ones that were used initially to conquer chess. And essentially, it comes down to the fact that if you have a very high branching factor with your game, if you have a very, very large number of potential moves at every point in the game, then as a search problem, the complexity is what's going to become very difficult for you if you use these kinds of methods. There are games, and the classic example would be one called Arima, which have a vastly higher branching factor even than Go. And these have been introduced as a test for AI programmers in terms of whether they can come up with techniques that can actually handle a really astronomically high branching factor. I'm not going to use chess or Go or anything that complicated because they are too complicated and you don't need all the extra complication in order to introduce the minimax algorithm. I'm going to use noughts and crosses, and I'm just really hoping that everyone is familiar with noughts and crosses. You will be by the time I've gone through another few slides. We have two players, and they're called Max and Min, again for historical reasons. Max moves first, they take it in turns to place pieces on the 3x3 board, and at the end of the game, someone has won or there is a draw. So it's exactly the same format as you have for the other more complicated games that I've spoken about. Now you can think of games like this as a search problem because you have a starting state, and in the case of noughts and crosses, that's an empty 3x3 grid, and it's Max's go to move first. You also have a set of operators, which are like actions in the language that we were using earlier. In this case, Max can place a cross in any empty square, and when it's Min's turn, Min can place a nought in any empty square. There's a terminal test, which is game AI nomenclature that takes the place of what we were previously calling a goal. The terminal test allows us to know whether the game has ended. In the case of noughts and crosses, if there are 3 noughts in a row or 3 crosses in a row, then in the former case Max has won, in the latter case Min has won. But if there are no unused spaces and you don't have rows of 3 for either player, then it's a draw. And the utility, or the payoff function, tells us numerically what the outcome of the game is. So that might, for example, be +1 if it's a win for Max, -1 if it's a loss for Max, and 0 if the game's a draw. Now once we've seen that as a way of setting up a two-person game, you can construct a tree, a search tree in pretty much all respects, that represents the entire game. Okay, it represents all possible ways in which a game can be played out. In the case of noughts and crosses, at the outset Max has 9 possible moves that can be made, because Max can put a cross in any empty square. After that it's Min's turn to play. Now, Min can't put a nought in a square that's already occupied by a cross. So for each of Max's opening moves, Min can respond in 8 possible ways because there are 8 empty squares remaining on the board. And if you continue in this way, you end up with a tree that contains all possible ways in which the game can play out. In this case, at the bottom left here, I have a situation which is a draw, because all the squares are occupied, but neither player has a row of 3 of their piece, a nought or a cross. At the middle bottom of the diagram, I have a win for Max because there are 3 crosses in a row. And on the bottom right of the diagram, I have a win for Min because Min has managed to get 3 noughts in a row before the squares are all filled up. Now, once you've generated the entire tree for the game, you can label all its leaves in this way. Having labelled the leaves with the outcome of the game for all possible ways in which you can play the game, because those are all now represented in the tree, you can use the structure that you built to decide what might be a good opening move for Max. Now here I've made a much simpler tree. This game only ever has 2 moves. Max can make an opening move, and Max has one of 4 possibilities. In response to Max's opening move, Min can then make a move, and Min will have 4 possibilities. And that leads to the situation in the diagram where the upward pointing triangles at the base of the diagram are the final states of the game, and they're labelled with the utility function. Now here's where we make a claim that allows us to come up with a game playing algorithm. And the claim is that if Max is rational in the way that he plays, he should want to reach a terminal position in the game for which he has the biggest utility possible. And again, I'm measuring utility here as being a high value when it's in Max's favour, and a low value when it's in Min's favour. So if Min is rational, then she will play in a way that minimises the utility that's there at the end of the game. So if we now apply that to this tree structure that tells us all the possibilities for how a game can play out, what will happen? Well, Min will always play in order to reach a final position that has a low utility. So, on the left-hand side of this diagram, Min's move can result in a utility of 4 or 5 or 2 or 20. And if Min is playing rationally, then she will play from that position to get the outcome of 2. In the second subtree, Min can play in order to get a utility of 20, 15, 6 or 7. And if Min is playing rationally, she will select the move that leads to the smallest utility, which is 6. And the same argument can be applied to the third and fourth subtrees in this diagram. So what we've done there is backed up the utilities from the leaves of the tree to the penultimate layer of the tree, assuming that Min is playing in a rational manner. Having done that, we can just say, well, in the opening move, if Max is playing rationally, then he will select the move that guarantees the best possible utility, and now Max is trying to maximise utility. So for this very simple game, Max will play the second possible move, because that way Max can guarantee that the ultimate outcome will have a utility of 6. Whereas if Max takes any of the alternative opening moves, Min can immediately force a lower utility than 6. And so for a rational player, the second move that guarantees a utility of 6 is the one that Max should be making. So the minimax algorithm in general works as follows. And this can be applied to any game of the kind that we're discussing here. In principle, you generate the complete tree, you label the leaves according to the utility function, then you work from the leaves of the tree back towards the root. You label the nodes on the way depending on whether it's max or min, whose turn it is to move. If it's min's move, you label the current node with the minimum utility of any of the descendants. And if it's max's turn to move, you label the node with the maximum utility of any of the descendants. And if the game is p-ply, and at each point there are q available moves, then that gives you an order q to the p time complexity. And the space complexity is linear in p and q, because you can do this in a depth-first manner. And as usual, that potentially leaves us with a problem, because, as we've already seen, the branching factor here is going to tend to be pretty high, and the depth might be fairly high also. So P and Q can both be pretty big, and that's going to leave us with a problem in terms of the time it takes for us to actually do this. So how can we avoid generating the entire tree and completing this process in its entirety, but still try to make decent decisions in order to come up with a good game player? Well, there are two initial things that we can do. The first is to avoid generating the entire tree. So the first idea here is that instead of testing whether or not a node is a leaf, in the sense that it corresponds to a valid win or loss or draw within the game, we introduce a cutoff test. Now all that means is that we will decide to stop generating the tree at some point before the game has finished. Now if we do that, clearly we can't apply the utility function to work out whether it's a win, loss or draw. So instead of doing that, we introduce an evaluation function, which is a way of taking a position within the game that isn't a win or loss or draw, and assigning to it a number that evaluates how good that position is from, in this case, Max's viewpoint. You can think of it as a way of looking at a position within the game before the game is finished and trying to make an assessment of how likely, for example, it may be that Max can get to a win from that position. Now we may of course cut off at a point where it's Min's turn to play. In that case the evaluation function is going to be trying to work out how good a position it is from Min's perspective. Okay, but that's easy because what's good for Max is bad for Min and vice versa. And at this point we get back once more to the fact that an awful lot of the time in developing AI programs, it's an input of human ingenuity that ends up being important. The single most critical thing in designing good AI game players with the minimax approach that we're talking about here is the design of the evaluation function. And this really requires the use of human experts who know and understand the game, and using their expertise to try and put together a way of taking an arbitrary position within a game and assessing how good it might be from one of the other players' perspective. Now, human players clearly make use of this kind of approach in their play. If you show a chessboard to an expert human player, they will be able to make some kind of assessment about how good the position they're looking at is in terms of potentially leading to a win to one player or the other. And it's a fairly safe bet that good chess players are also making such assessments when they're playing games. Chess, in fact, has the idea of material value, because some pieces are regarded as more powerful than others within the game. And so a very blunt way in which to measure the quality of a particular chess position from the perspective of one player is to look at the total material value for the pieces left on the board for each player and see what the difference is. But in order to play chess well, we need something much better than that. So one expects that considerable work may have to go into coming up with a really good evaluation function if it's going to lead to a decent AI player. Now, part of the need for expertise here is also in the fact that that function has to be computable in a reasonable amount of time. Clearly, if we just ran minimax in its entirety using the entire game tree, we get a perfect evaluation function, or at least a very good one. One has to be a little careful here in that there's an underlying assumption in all of this that both players are playing rationally. If both players are not necessarily playing rationally, then things can get a little more complicated, and in fact there is a question in the problem sheet that gets you to try and think about that, so I'm not going to say any more. But what we want is a function that is reasonably quick to compute and that gives us an assessment of how good an arbitrary position is from the point of view of one of the players.